Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee. On behalf of Muslim advocates, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the civil rights of American Muslims today. And Mr. Chairman and Senator Graham, I want to especially thank you for your leadership in holding this hearing and bringing much needed attention to rising anti-Muslim bigotry. We've been hearing from Americans from all faith backgrounds and all walks of life who recognize that it's really become a growing menace to the safety and, frankly, the social fabric of our nation. So it's especially heartening to see bipartisan support on this issue. I was born and raised in Painted Post, a small town in rural upstate New York. At the start of every school day, like school children across America, I stood and recited the Pledge of Allegiance. The last line of the pledge says that we are one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. There's no qualifier. It's just simply that we are one nation with liberty and justice for all. As the subcommittee knows well, our nation has a unique, long-cherished commitment to freedom, particularly religious freedom. In fact, Muslims have been a part of America for centuries, since the first slave ships arrived at its shores. Today, American Muslims reflect every race and ethnicity that comprise our nation's rich heritage. That's why recent rhetoric demonizing Islam and Muslims, brutal attacks, harassment, and discrimination, and in some cases even threatening to kill Americans, including children, based on their faith, is so vile. It is not who we are as Americans, and it has no place in the schoolhouse, in the workplace, or in our communities. Nearly 10 years after 9/11, hate crimes motivated by anti-Muslim bias targeting Muslim, Arab, Sikh, and South Asian Americans remain higher than levels before 9/11. Some are deadly. Late last summer, a New York taxi driver was stabbed and almost died after a passenger asked him whether he was a Muslim. Just earlier this year, 2 elderly Sikh men were gunned down while taking an afternoon stroll through their neighborhood in Northern California, killing one and critically injuring the other. Employment discrimination complaints are at an all-time high, with Muslim bias-based complaints comprising 25%. 25% of complaints received by the EEOC from 2008 to 2009, while Muslims comprise only 1 to 2% of the entire population. Opposition to mosque construction is also on the rise and getting uglier. And Muslim, Arab, Sikh, and South Asian parents are more concerned than ever about their children. In one especially egregious case, a Muslim high school student in Staten Island was subjected to a harrowing ordeal in which he was frequently labeled a terrorist, punched in the groin, and spat on by fellow teenagers. Sometimes his mother would catch him rocking back and forth, saying, "Why me? What did I ever do to them?" One day, he was beaten so severely that his mother took him to a doctor. There was blood in his urine, and he suffered from headaches and memory loss. His assailants were later arrested and charged with a hate crime. This is just one vile example of how anti-Muslim bigotry is playing out ferociously across America today. Parents worry, will my child be next? And they worry about the future. Will America be hospitable to minority faiths? Will its better angels prevail? Or will the values of freedom and respect become a relic of the past? Anti-Muslim bigotry has been simmering and growing since the tragic events of September 11th, a terrorist attack that was an attack on all Americans, Muslims included. But in the last several months, anti-Muslim rhetoric has reached a disturbing new level. Prominent religious, military, and even political leaders have joined the fray, feeding fear and hysteria, with some going so far as to say Islam is a cult, not a religion. Now, one just might want to dismiss such statements as silly and absurd, if not for the fact that the vitriol has real life and death consequences for Muslim, Arab, Sikh, and South Asian Americans and their families. The message is clear. You are not welcome. Words that were graffitied last year on a sign for a mosque in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. But what gives me hope, Mr. Chairman, is knowing that more and more Americans from all walks of life are coming together to reject fear and divisiveness because they recognize that it's not American. As former Secretary of State Colin Powell poignantly said, quote, "Is there something wrong with being a Muslim in this country? The answer is no, that's not America," unquote. I commend the stepped-up enforcement of the nation's civil rights laws under the Attorney General's leadership, but challenges remain and more must be done. I refer the subcommittee to my written testimony for specific recommendations of steps Congress and the administration should take and ask that my full written testimony be entered for the record. I would be happy to discuss those recommendations later in the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I can tell as a former staffer, you knew you had 5 minutes. And the Senate for a long time. I can't recall a panel that's been so impressive. I thank you, all three of you, for your testimony. It really was heartfelt and is going to make an excellent record of what we are trying to talk about today. I want to address an issue raised by Cardinal McCarrick and put it in terms of the topic that's before us. And the Cardinal said, I'm going to quote you here, "Where is the respect for religious freedom in compelling a religious entity to act in ways which contradict its most basic moral principles?" And now let's move this principle or thought to the question of Sharia law. You heard the question I asked earlier of Mr. Perez about where the line should be drawn. We certainly know the excesses of Sharia law. They're publicized every day. The killing of this man in Pakistan who made controversy by saying he was opposed to the blasphemy laws. He gave his life for speaking out for tolerance. The same thing that suggested stoning of women for certain transgressions in Muslim countries. Those, for many people, are the images of Sharia law. I'd like to ask you, Ms. Khera, put what the Cardinal said in the context of Sharia law and what we know to be excesses in some contexts, but to be part of Muslim religious practice in a very peaceful way in another context.
Right. Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. I think, as you pointed out, and Mr. Perez pointed out earlier as well, for everyday American Muslims, what Sharia really means is those guidelines that guide our everyday life. So whether it's prayer, fasting, issues of marriage, in the way that religious law guides those everyday activities for Christians and Jews and other faith communities in the United States. The kinds of, should I say, excesses of Sharia that you've outlined, I cannot imagine the circumstances under which they would be tolerated here in America in our legal system. There is, as a legal matter, the Supremacy Clause ensures that the Constitution is the law of the land, no religious law, no foreign law, and that is absolutely important, and something that I'm personally very thankful for is there. So I think this question of Sharia and these efforts to introduce bills to ban Sharia are just woefully misguided, and they're chasing a threat that does not exist. But the implications, if they're actually allowed to be enacted, is taking, for example, like the Oklahoma one, could have very significant consequences in terms of the religious practice of American Muslims here at home, and that's why it does concern us.
So I'll ask you to go a step further, because the case we talked about here, the American Muslim who raised the case in Oklahoma, was objecting, saying that it was Sharia law that had guided him in the execution of his will, how he would leave his property after death. Can you give me other illustrations? I mean, as I said, the stereotype of Sharia law is extreme, and we wouldn't countenance it for any religion in this country. Can you give me other illustrations of Sharia law in the life of an American Muslim that you believe should be understood by most?
So the one example you gave is a very good one in terms of the way some people may decide to write a will. It may also entail decisions to get married, and those who get married under religious law in terms of how they go about their life, things like the prayer, how they pray, when they pray, fasting, which is also a cornerstone of the faith, those are just some examples.
And as well, I believe donations.
Yes, charitable giving is an obligation for American Muslims, as it is for many people of faith in this country.
And the Hajj.
And the Hajj, yes, thank you. Which was a topic earlier in the hearing, thank you. The pilgrimage is something that's required for American Muslims as well.
I realized after 9/11, I didn't even know the pillars of Islam, and I was trying to recall some of them as you testified.
Ms. Khera, let me ask you a similar question. You belong to an organization which has been very clear about its positions on the website, for example. I wonder if you've made any public pronouncement or statement condemning those religious leaders who've employed violent or hateful rhetoric or promoted hateful views of others' religious groups. Have you done that, or has your website done that?
Well, let me maybe by way of background.
As a former staffer, you know that my time is very limited. You don't have a lot of background. I have 3 quick questions here. Have you done that?
Yeah, well, let me just clarify, Senator Kyle. My organization's work is focused on protecting and upholding our constitutional values.
So you haven't condemned the hateful speech of those who have criticized others in the way that I mentioned then?
I guess I would have to know more specifically which particular case you're talking about.
Well, let me just ask you this. Would you today criticize threats of death or physical harm directed at writers or commentators who have criticized Islamic extremism? You would condemn that today, would you not?
I think we have in our country a very cherished fidelity to the First Amendment, and that includes a freedom of speech. Not questioning
whether people have the right to speak. The question is whether you would agree that that speech is helpful or hurtful, whether you would condemn it or be neutral about it.
Those who would threaten to kill somebody because of their political views, religious views, that's inappropriate.
And I'm specifically talking about the website. I guess I should identify your site here, which I will in just a moment.
It's MuslimAdvocates.org.
Yeah. And it is MuslimAdvocates.org, is
yes.
that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Let me just refer you to several cases here last year and then ask you about something on your website. Just last year, U.S. intelligence agents and our justice system uncovered and prosecuted a number of attempted terrorist attacks that were planned by radical Muslim extremists. A compilation produced by the Investigative Project on Terrorism, based on recent Justice Department reports, lists just the following incidents. On November 27th, Mohammed Osman Mohammed was arrested and charged with attempting to explode a car bomb in Portland, Oregon. October 27th, Farouk Ahmed was arrested for attempting to assist others whom he believed to be members of al-Qaeda in planning multiple bombings in the metro area here in Washington. October 19th, Hossam Samdi was sentenced to 24 years in prison for attempting to blow up a skyscraper in Dallas, Texas. October 18th, a federal court in Manhattan found that James Crow Meady and 4 others were guilty of attempting to detonate explosives near a synagogue in Bronx. On August 2nd, Russell Drefridis and Abdul Qadir were convicted of a conspiracy to attack John F. Kennedy Airport by exploding fuel tanks under the airport. On June 21st, Faisal Shahzad pleaded guilty to attempting to detonate a car bomb in Times Square. He was sentenced to life in prison. On March 18th, David Headley pleaded guilty to charges that he participated in planning the November 2008 attacks in Mumbai, India, which killed 164 people. Every one of these incidents could have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of people. In fact, the Headley plot, of course, did, including 6 Americans. All of these terrorists were obviously indifferent to whom they killed, including women and children. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to the enforcement agents who identified and stopped the plots before they could be carried out. In view of this history, I was curious about your website, the so-called community alert section, which is apparently directed to American Muslims. Notes, and I quote, "The FBI is contacting American Muslims to elicit information and advice about addressing violent extremism. Muslim Advocates strongly urges individuals not to speak to law enforcement officials without the presence of a lawyer." And I was stunned that you would issue that kind of instruction to people who would read your site, since obviously cooperation from Muslim Americans is one of the best ways that law enforcement can uncover terrorist plots like the ones that I described. And it seems to me that it's the civic obligation of all Americans to assist in preventing these heinous crimes, especially given the participation of Muslims in all of the attempted attacks that I mentioned. I would think that Muslim Americans would feel a special obligation to help intelligence agencies root this out. Do you think it's wrong to investigate and prosecute the individuals that I mentioned? And do you stand by the Muslim Advocates Community Alert instructing Muslim Americans not to cooperate with the FBI and other law enforcement investigating potential acts of terrorism, or at least not without having a lawyer present?
Senator Kyle, I fully understand the threat that we are facing. On September 11th, I was working right here in the Capitol, and I ran from the Capitol with my colleagues as we thought planes were approaching. So I fully understand the threat. Those who engage in criminal acts must be stopped and brought to justice. And every American has a civic duty to report criminal activity to law enforcement. And I might add that Attorney General Holder has actually said that the cooperation of the American Muslim community has been essential to detecting and thwarting terrorist plots. At the same time, every American has the right to seek legal advice. And that's a right that's guaranteed to every American. And I know you're a lawyer, we're both lawyers, and I think we both know that our legal system is quite complex. And so encouraging community members to seek legal advice as they interact with law enforcement is something that every American has a right to do.
So you stand by that statement on your website?
I stand by all the statements on my website.